Certainly Ohio has been significant. Usually Alex has a few jokes or stories about me when he does his introductions and that sort of thing. This was a picture of Alex. When was this taken, Alex? Probably in the 1980s? I think so. Alex used to kid me about the NASP archives, and he sent me this picture one time of what the NASP archives probably really looked like. And actually, the space isn't quite that large. You could probably get most of it in one of those caskets there. After Alex spent 19 years as a practitioner and got into the training, he became more of a theoretician, and this was Alex's new stage theory of human development that he worked on. So it was the 4 stages of life that Alex worked on, and we think we're still at the beer stage, I think. At least what we're trying to work on there. I want to dedicate today's talk to several significant individuals in my own career, in the early career. Starting in the lower left, or lower right, I guess it is to you, I'm there with Paul Warden. Paul received his doctorate at Kent State University in 1970 and then went to Oklahoma State University and retired from there in 2002 and died about a year ago. With him there is Larry Litwack seated. Larry died about a year ago, and he was the chair of the Department of Student Personnel and Counseling Services at Kent State. John Guidabaldi, a former NASP president, is there. In the lower left is Don Ferguson. Don Ferguson came to Kent in 1959 after getting his doctorate at Western Reserve. Several people got their doctorates at Western Reserve. In the more modern history, I guess you'd say, of school psychology. In the early history, you'll see that Ohio State University granted many of these doctorates. Don Ferguson died about 4 or 5 years ago. He started up the program at Kent State University in the late 1950s. And when I was at Kent State, he was my first advisor. My second advisor is Don Wonderly, with whom I'm sharing a drink during one of the NASP conventions in probably 1987, I think, in Chicago, 87 or 88. And in the other picture there, you can see Bob Myers from Akron University. On the left, Julia Wright, former president from here, treasurer of NASP, and Lloyd Cagle, who was my intern supervisor in 1966. After I graduated with my master's degree at Kent. That goes back far enough that there were no APA-accredited doctoral programs anywhere in the country in school psychology until 1971. So a lot of what you're going through and suffering through in many ways is really the modern history of school psychology. It was kind of interesting in that year that Don Wonderly was the executive director of OSPA. From 1963 to 1967, was given an honorary life award, I believe, when he retired from that in 1967. And Lloyd Cagle was OSPA president at that time. So when you're an intern to the executive director and the president of OSPA at the time, you find out a lot about a lot of people, you get introduced and you meet a lot of people. And for me at least, it was very nice to be a part of the organization at that time, including the Kent Area School Psychologists, as it was then called. Wonderly also took his doctorate from Western Reserve, and he retired from Kent State University in 1983. When he was executive director of OSPA, he was paid $1, and it was joked about that he was worth every penny of it. What I want to do today is give you sort of a personal tour of my remembrances of many aspects of school psychology in Ohio. I want to thank several agencies and organizations that have contributed to this. I've spent a fair amount of time trying to track down some photos of people that you might have never heard of, let alone seen pictures of, so we'll try and have some of those. Some of the materials I received from Joe Perry in Cleveland, I'll show you those, or Bill Russ in Cincinnati, who sent me a fair number of test kits and materials that were used. This is a 1937 Form L Binet, and I got a box of these from Cincinnati at one time back in the 1980s, and I'll show you a slide of what one of those practitioners had that they were using quite a bit as well. We will make about 15 stops on the tour today. Let me begin by saying that about 120 years ago, in July of 1892, G. Stanley Hall, father of child study, the first Ph.D. in America in that, gathered several people in his office at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, and founded the American Psychological Association. That was in 1892. It was pretty much more on the science than the artistic side of things. There was no code of ethics for the American Psychological Association until 1953. So for a long time, it was involved in activities much unlike what it's involved with today. I suspect that many of the roots that he started there, some of his graduates in that, moved west to the large cities of the Great Lakes states and some to the West Coast, and they put down many roots in Ohio. And we'll be talking about some of those roots this morning and some of the blooms that came from those in terms of academics, clinical areas and clinics themselves, organizational and literary history. Neither Hall nor Lightner Whitmer, shown in this photo, probably from the early 1900s, who is considered, they're considered sort of co-founders of school psychology based on child study as well as clinical psychology. Lightner Whitmer started the first psychological clinic in 1896 at the University of Pennsylvania. I don't know if anybody at Penn knows where that was at that time, but these two individuals had descendants that came to Ohio and started a number of things and had a number of students of their own that would spread school psychology across the state in a variety of ways. Alex alluded to this, and so I'll just mention that when I got my doctorate at Kent in 1969, there was no parent permission required, particularly in most places around the country. It was used a lot in Ohio, but that was mainly a courtesy. You'll find articles, brief articles in the Journal of School Psychology arguing against parent permission on the grounds that parents really don't know anything about this to begin with. Why should we be getting their permission to do it? Many of us probably still feel that way occasionally. There was no 94-142, what you now know as IDEA. There was no FERPA, Family Rights and Privacy Act. The primary tools in the school psychologist's arsenal were the 1949 WISC, including the 49 norms. That was WISC 1. And the 1960 Binet, which we could probably say was really about Binet 5, but for all practical purposes it was still referred to as Binet 1 in 1960. It would then be redone in 1972, 1984, and then I guess in the 90s and again in the years 2000. It's interesting to me that there were no officially recognized, easily tracked minority groups in any of the manual until the WISC-R in 1974-75-ish. So they essentially were not on the radar in terms of the representativeness of norm groups at that time. And mental retardation in the state of Ohio and in most states, and including the AAMR's own guidelines in the 1960s, started at -1 standard deviation. So we placed children in EMR classes in Ohio and across the land with an IQ of 85 or less on the Wechsler scales, 84 or less on the Binet scales. And I would guess at the time the field was probably at least 60 to 70% male at that time, and more so if you went to certain states. There'll be a number of stops on the tour today. These are just the ones, and I'll mention them again as we go along. And we will try to move along as fast as we need to in order to cover this and get done by 11:30. And these will be the other stops on the tour. Images often reveal how we've changed. I like this slide because it's a 1951 photo of the Girls Rifle Club at Central High School in Memphis, Tennessee. They don't have a Girls Rifle Club anymore. In fact, if you even bring a water gun into school, you'll probably get a 180-day suspension. But it lets us know how things have changed over the many, many years, and some of the images today, I think, will show you some of that as well. Stop number 1 will be 2 regional surveys that were done. These were done on a national basis, one in 1911 by Van Sickle, Whitmer, and Ayers, one in 1914 by John Edward Wallace Wallen, and they include data about what was going on in Ohio at that time, but they're almost never mentioned, and I suspect that most people have never heard of or seen these. The first slide shows the regional data across. Now, I know you can't read this from there, but if you look at the top on the upper left, it'll say North Atlantic. North Atlantic had 370 cities reporting something like exceptional children's services, and North Central, which includes Ohio, had 322 The rest did not have much. Special ed starts in the Northeast. Psychology is starting in the Northeast, radiating west to the Great Lakes and the West Coast, but not to a lot of other places. Nevertheless, there was a lot going on in some places. And here you can see that in the North Central region, Ohio has 31 cities reporting something like special ed in 1911. Some of the classes probably even went back before that. I find it interesting that Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin had the bulk of what was going on in the North Central states. And when NASP is founded many, many years later, 60 years later, you find that that particular cluster of states had most of the leadership in the first 10 years of NASP and probably half the membership in the first year and a third of the membership for a long time, and continues to have a lot of members in it today as well. This is a list of the cities in that survey that had special education, what they called exceptional children's services. Places didn't have much in the way of legislation requiring things. You can see here the X's that Cleveland and Cincinnati and even Coshocton had a fair number of different kinds of classes in here. Vocational classes were particularly important. Night classes offered for parents were often considered exceptional services. A lot of vocational stuff. Continuation schools were started because if you graduated or left the school district, there were compulsory school laws, but if you left school before you were done with the 8th grade, say in Cincinnati, you had to go to school something like 4 hours a week for the next couple of years in order to have a trade that you could practice. There was a lot of concern about dropouts. Once you got compulsory schooling, you had a whole new problem in America and in the various states that had compulsory schooling. That problem was called dropouts. Prior to then, you had drop-ins. You went to school whenever the hell you felt like it, and you went one year and you didn't go the next year and whatever. Once you had requirements, you then had attendance officers. Your money began to flow based on average daily attendance. Somebody had to take attendance, and quite a concern about vocational schooling was very big at that time, and one of the earliest legislative enactments, the National Vocational Education Act of 1913, is something that continues to be very big, and we continue to talk about the importance of jobs, the importance of job training in the schools. We can see here that the classes for feeble-minded and seriously backward were present in Ohio. These are the cities and the classes that they had. So, for example, Cleveland started a class for that in 1879. The class type was called backward. They had 17 classes. That's a lot, with 10 to 20 in each class. You can see that a lot of different names were used at that time. Remember that until you had some reliable way of classifying intelligence, which would become the basis of the use of the Binet scales, you really were having a hard time deciding who had anything like mild, moderate, and severe levels of anything, because you didn't have a reliable way of doing it. So when things like the Binet scales come to America in 1908 by Goddard bringing it from France, then developing his own, which sold for, I think, 15 cents, and then you have the original Binet in 1916, these tests do as much to create a system of classification as they do to put children in special classes over the course of the 20th century. So here you can get an idea. FM means feeble-minded here, and that was a very popular term. Moron would be a popular term coined by Goddard in 1910 at a meeting in Illinois. You can see that Lakewood, Ohio had 1 class, Toledo 15. This is a fair number of things going on for backward, seriously defective, 4 years pedagogically retarded. We used to speak of reading and math retardation for children that were behind so many years before you had learning disability, which really doesn't get categorized officially till about 1968. These would be the persons providing these services around 1913, 1914. You can barely see there that they are doing medical, psychological, and educational evaluations, for example, in Cleveland. The Binet tester is doing them, and it's being given by a special class teacher who probably had a summer course or a weekend course on the Binet scales. And we can see that that's true also in Cincinnati. We'll talk more about Cincinnati in a minute. Columbus is not on this chart. We can see here that Columbus is on this one, where they were also doing educational and psychological and medical evaluations. Dayton and Toledo were as well. And it shows the character and the training of the individuals on these charts. As a general rule, almost all of them were using some version of the Binet. Now, this is before the Terman version of the Stanford Binet in 1916. So they were using other Binets, maybe with local norms, still using it as an age scale, and they were using it a hell of a lot of the time, and they were getting a very modest amount of training. So a Binet tester or the Binet person might have had a weekend class or one course in the summer on a workshop, but generally did not have a whole lot more training. As a general rule, the communities got smaller and smaller, begin to see that there's less and less money allocated, less and less training, and that you're getting fewer and fewer people with doctoral degrees or even master's degrees in psychology giving these. So it wasn't at all unusual for a special class teacher of the feeble-minded or seriously backward to be paid $50 more a year. She probably wasn't paid more than a few $100s a year to begin with. And she might get a summer class and be the person who not only teaches children with intellectual disabilities, but be the one that does the evaluations as well. This is a listing of the clinics in Wallen Survey. The darker dots, the black dots there, represent clinics in school systems. The blue dots there represent them in hospitals or universities. You can see, again, how much of psychology was concentrated in the Northeast, and how much of it was concentrated around the Great Lakes states as well. You can see the Chicago Clinic in 1899, which was the first school-based clinic at that time, following Whitmer's first clinic of any type in 1896. You can see the dot for Cincinnati, and that's our next stop on the tour. This is a picture of the Winton School. I got this picture out of this book when Bill Russ sent me a box of the annual reports of the Cincinnati Vocational Bureau. It had the Winton School picture in it and a lot of other kind of interesting data that would be connected to school psychology. The Winton School happened to be built that year. That's the only reason the picture was in the book. I don't think it was where their bureau was or that it had any other special significance for that matter. Nevertheless, there is a short history of the Vocational Bureau written in a 1941 publication that I have a copy of here, as well as Beverly Beach's doctoral dissertation that I'm sure is available, and OSPA probably has a copy of that. And it shows that school psychology, for all practical purposes, probably got its first leg up in the Cincinnati Vocational Bureau. It didn't start because they had the Binet scales. Actually, the Stanford Binet wasn't out yet. It got started because there was an interest in having psychological evaluations of ability. Maybe the De Sanctis scales or the Goddard version could be used to get some sense of the normality of children that needed to have vocational kinds of training. You could drop out of school, but if you dropped out without an 8th grade education, you had to come back to a continuation school. And in 1910, Ohio had passed a law that required the school districts to issue a work permit. And it would be the Vocational Bureau's job to issue that work permit and to help fight dropping out and to help determine children who had sort of these kinds of skills or these kinds of skills for various kinds of jobs. That bureau would start in 1911, and the first director, what we might call around the first school psychologist of sorts in Ohio, would be Helen Thompson Woolley. I had never seen pictures of Woolley until I started digging around and found some online and from some of the places where she had gone to school. She had come to the University of Cincinnati in 1910, I believe, with her husband, who was a physician, and they were working on the faculty at the University of Cincinnati when that law passed about vocational work, and that's when she moved to the Cincinnati public schools, and the Cincinnati schools ponied up about $250 in order to get that started at that time. She was born in Chicago. She took her Ph.D. at Chicago in 1900 under John Dewey. She was an experimental psychologist, as was almost everybody that was anything in psychology in those days. You really didn't have applied psychology programs that early, and if they were usually a practicum, a field experience, a few testing courses or something tacked onto the experimental work that you were getting in psychology. We see that continue to linger throughout the history of American psychology. The scientist-practitioner model doesn't start with the word scientist for nothing in terms of the negotiations and the ways that APA did things. She became a lecturer in 1909 at the University of Cincinnati, went to the Cincinnati schools in 1911. This was one of the most distinguished bureaus around the country at that time, and it did mental tests and vocational guidance that connected children with special education who were low functioning to get vocational training for them as well. She was in that district. This is a picture of her from 1910 to 1921, when she left and went to the Merrill Palmer Institute and helped develop the Merrill Palmer scales. Later, she would go to Teachers College, Columbia University. Her career sort of followed her husband's medical career. The Bureau was initially funded privately by charitable agencies in Cincinnati, then publicly. They had about $5,000 in 1911, $60,000 by the time she left in 1922. Her successor was Mabel Fernald, the sister of Grace Fernald, who developed the important reading remediation kinds of ways. And by the time the middle of Mabel Fernald's reign in the Cincinnati schools, the Bureau had $131,000 and had grown from a few clerks to 45 professional persons and 30 clerical workers in 1936. So this was a big operation. Bill Russ even sent me a copy. He wouldn't give me the thing because it's just too confidential, but they have in Cincinnati, in their archive somewhere, a ledger of every child by name and when they were tested, what school they were in, what their IQs were, and what their reevaluations might have been. It's about that thick, and I'm sure it's quite an amazing thing to see a ledger like that they were keeping that kind of data. But as you'll see, they were keeping a lot of data about children in those days. Children were considered extremely important. They were going to be the future of American society, and they needed to have jobs. They needed a vocational bureau. We needed to know how smart they were, and hence you get the psychological clinic inside the vocational bureau there. Mabel Fernald, very important to the Cincy schools. She was born in Springfield, Ohio in 1883, died in 1952, took her undergraduate work at Mount Holyoke College, Massachusetts, took her Ph.D. at the University of Chicago in 1910. She taught at Denison University, then Chicago Teachers College, then the University of Minnesota. And during World War I, she was the only woman on the staff of the Surgeon General during World War I. She was Director of Psychological Services in Cincinnati from 1921 until her retirement in 1948. That's a long time. You don't usually have directors of anything anymore that serve that many years. She was her successor was Stella Whiteside, who had a Ph.D. at the University of Michigan in 1932 and was assistant director in Cincinnati from 43 to 50, and then director from 1950 to 1964. This gives you an idea. This is one of the tests that Bill Russ sent to me. It was a puzzle test. It was used at Ellis Island. I've been to Ellis Island in New York. I've seen this there, and when I went there and saw some of the things they had, I thought, you know, I've got almost all of those tests in my collection. The boat puzzle, the little weights that would be scrambled in front of the children, and they would have to line them up from the lightest to the heaviest. Not an easy task, but the concept of just noticeable differences that you probably learned about in your learning theory class at one time was certainly very rampant at that time. In theory, if a person at Ellis Island couldn't put the boat puzzle back together, they might have to get back on the boat and go home. And not many did, but a few certainly had that do it. Not many did because Ellis Island, the rules for the shipping companies was such that if you had a person on your boat that couldn't become a citizen in the U.S. and be admitted, you had to pay their way back to Italy or Europe or Greece or wherever. So in order to offset that, they often pre-tested people before they ever let them on and made sure they knew their name and where they were going and what they were going to do. Mabel Fernald had a Form L, or Form M kit, and this is a slide of that. This is Form L here. It's basically exactly the same as the one you're seeing the slide of. It has somewhat different parts, but the manual had norms for Form L and Form M. And the 1937 Binet, many of those items are still on the Binet. The 1937 Binet was used up until 1960. The 1960 version was used until about 1985. So the Binet scales were pretty much the only game in town for reliable intellectual assessment, and it's really the backbone of school psychology's work in the first half of the 20th century. It's hard to imagine the impact of this. We had people in the U.S. Office of Education who were advocating that every child is tested with the Binet when they enter the schools and placed accordingly for the remainder of their school career. Imagine if you had to give the Whisk or the Benet or the Woodcock Johnson to every kid that came into school. You'd be busy, and you can see why caseloads at some points in your past were probably in excess of 1,000 evaluations a year. How could you do 1,000 evaluations a year with the Benet scale? You used a slide rule like this. You got the test, you gave the test, you simply put on the MA, the CA on here, and it gives you the IQ. It even says on this, developed by Coase, who developed your block design tests in your Wechsler scales today. This is dated from about, I think it's in the 1920s. But it says on here, after a little practice, any IQ can be determined by means of this device within 15 seconds. And with a little practice, over 100 of them can be done in 25 minutes. So you spent your day testing and your night spinning the wheel. And it wasn't unusual for people to have hundreds of them. When I first went to Louisiana in 1980 to help them start school psychology programs, they were still doing 700 cases a year in school-based clinics. In the early days of OSPA, it's reported in your 50th anniversary booklet that the requirement was expected to be about 900 in many of the school districts, and I suspect that at one time it was perhaps even larger than that. Mabel's persistence with the Cincinnati schools got their salary up to teacher salary instead of civil service, and she expanded special educational services. Another interesting thing in the 1912 report, which is here, it's the only one I got from them that was hardbound, and it would be based on the first year of their clinic, was that it had a necrology in it. You would not see this today, but the necrology listed all the children and their ages and what they died of, as well as all the teachers for that particular year. And today you can hardly find out who the hell's even in your school district, let alone who died last year and from what. And I kind of summarized that at one time just to get an idea, but respiratory diseases, tuberculosis, and that were very, very rampant at that time. They took a high toll on children as well as adults. There are other diseases in there that you pretty much don't get anymore, like infantile paralysis, polio, although we're seeing a small rise, I think, again in that. And part of the reason is because now you get shots for diphtheria and other kinds of things as a rule to get into the schools. But the schools were relatively unhealthy places in the early 1900s when you had compulsory schooling and you didn't have a high degree of public health or high technology medicine or medications and that, and children were coming to school with a variety of difficulties. Respiratory difficulties were certainly among those. So what do you do with children who have respiratory difficulties? You start something called an open air school. These are children probably in Buffalo, this is not a picture from Cincinnati, who are being educated on the roof of the school in the dead of winter. And there are warm stones underneath their feet to keep them warm, and they were gathering data on this. So if you go online and looking for an interesting report sometime, do a paper on the open air school movement from roughly 1900 to about 1930. As public health improved and treatments for tuberculosis improved, these kinds of classes were no longer needed. In most places, they were for children who were maybe at risk of getting this. They weren't allowing kids with tuberculosis to come into the schools. Well, did they have any of these in Ohio? Well, certainly they did. They had these here showing on the left in the Cleveland public schools, and on the on the right in Cleveland, and on the left in the Cincinnati schools. And these were classes where the windows would be open all the time probably, and it was cool, cold, not to say the least. And the children were, the achievement data was showing that they were doing better under these conditions than in the regular classroom, and that their attendance was 95%, even when the average temperature was about 20. So open air schooling I find is an interesting aspect of the history of special ed and school psychology. It was probably not connected to the vocational movement though in Cincinnati. But it's interesting because it's an example of an intervention we used at one time that we don't use anymore. Children now have ventilators and other kinds of medications and that help them. But I suspect that there will be other things that will occur in the 21st century in a technological way that will eliminate other aspects of school psychology and special education service. So the Columbus School was on, in 1913, was on Neal Avenue, and I'm not sure if it says where the Cleveland School was, but it does have that in that information. The idea of removing children, segregated special education, is connected to this. When you've got something and you don't know what the hell to do with it, you get rid of it. You move it. You don't have institutions in Ohio and other places out in the country for nothing. It wasn't because the people in the rural areas were nuts. It's that they needed a place for the people in the urban areas that had problems, mental health problems as well as physical health problems. When I was in kindergarten and first grade in Warren, Ohio, I was born there in 1943. When I was in school there, if your brother had measles or somebody in the house had chicken pox or something, the public health department came out and put a sign on the front of your house. It just said quarantine, and it basically meant nobody comes in and nobody comes out. We know how long this is going to go. We know a lot about it. We just don't know a whole hell of a lot about getting rid of it, but it wears itself out, so this house is quarantined. Schools are often very unhealthy places when you don't have a lot of that. For those of you who have taught young children, you probably found in your first few years of doing that you were ill a lot because they carry everything. Well, we'll go now to the Cleveland schools. In the woman in the upper left, or the upper level, is Bertha Lucky. Bertha Lucky came to the Cleveland schools as the first director. She got her Ph.D. in 1916 at the University of Nebraska. She came there and was director of services for the Cleveland Public Schools from 1917 until her retirement in 1960. They've probably had 4 or 5 directors ever since. I have Clifford Graves on here because he was one of the first African-American directors, I'm sure, in the country for psychological services, and he was there following her, and he was there from 1961 to 1977. Clifford Graves also got his doctorate at Western Reserve University in 1961, and Bertha Lucky was APA Division 16 president in 1949-50. She was a Division of Consulting Psychology 13 president, 1951-52. She co-presided with Carl Rogers in Division 12 in 1955. She was president of the American Association for the Mentally Retarded in 52-53 and the Ohio Psychological Association in 1940-41. She was one busy person. She was the only woman on the 6-member Committee on Training in Clinical Psychology when the Boulder Conference decided that they were going to have a scientist-practitioner model and they needed people on that committee. Clifford Graves worked with her. Clifford Graves then became director and worked with Carlos Cortez, who I recall, he died many years ago. Carlos was the director, I think, of the school psych program at Western Reserve University for many years. Well, what were those people doing? This was given to me by Joe Perry, a former director of the Cleveland Public Schools. It was put together by the superintendent, and I'm sure Bertha Lucky did most of the work on this in the late 1920s. And essentially it shows that the primary job of these people was to test children. The ratio was 1 school psychologist to 15,000 children in the Cleveland Public Schools. Each case was estimated to be $2.50 total cost, 30 minutes to over an hour for each case. I suspect, working on a 10% rule, that maybe a caseload could be over 1,000, as high as 1,500 for a school psychologist during those years. That's very, very high. They were using, of course, from the data in this picture, the new Binet, and you can see that they were seeing a fair number of cases. The categories the children were being classified as, based on this, go from top to bottom, very high, bright, normal, slow, dull, moron, imbecile, and idiot. Those are the categories for special ed, and those are the names down the left side of that scale. You can see that over time they were seeing more and more normal kids because they were probably getting more examiners and were exhausting the lower end of the IQ pool there and putting those children in special classes, and they didn't necessarily have to do all the re-evals. But those are the categories: moron, imbecile, and idiot. And as Alex alluded to earlier, we came up with nicer terms for these individuals as time went on, and we're now at intellectually disabled, with categorizations being recommended based on the intensity of the recommendations rather than the lowness of the scores. Another important area going on in Ohio at that time was Wallen's Diagnostic Teaching Clinic, apparently under the auspices of Miami of Ohio University, but this clinic was operating in Dayton in the late 1920s. And I was able to get some of these photos from the Archives of the History of American Psychology. Those of you that have belonged to CEC have probably heard of the Wallen Award. Anybody ever hear of the Wallen Award, given to an outstanding special educator each year? It's named after John Wallen. Not an Ohioan by birth, but he's running this clinic. Diagnostic teaching was the term for it. And you can see from the varied instrumentation here that his assistant, that woman, is giving respiratory type of evaluation, checking for possible TB and other problems. The thing that the student is standing on is called a volumeter, and at that time the volumeter cost $120. And the child stands on this on his tiptoes, and he sees how long he can stand on his tiptoes as a measure of how much willpower he has, or how much spunk he has, how much motivation. And as he begins to give up and flake out, the arrows on the top of that come down, and a buzzer goes off to let him know he just ain't got it, okay? The volumeter is quite a gadget. Also on the table here, you can see how many different things are there. You'll see on the table with the woman and the other guy, the young man taking the respiratory thing, a thing that fits on your head. It's a leftover from phrenology, and you put that thing, it looks like a spaceship, on your head, and it's called a comforteur. It tells you what the conformity is of your skull and where your strengths and weaknesses are. If they ever get this in your school district, you're done. You're out of a job, because they'll just have that, and vocational education will be on a roll again then. I like these slides because they show what school psychology, if you want to call it that, and diagnostic teaching was like in the 1920s and 30s, when you were basically a jack of all trades. He's got, on the one table there on the bottom, all kinds of measures for motor stuff, visual stuff, teaching the structure of the eye. They're doing hearing evaluations, vision examination, some kinds of medical evaluations, lots of different puzzle tests, the form board. It's really kind of interesting, all the things that are there. Notice the sheets on the wall. We didn't have overhead projectors back then, not that I was there, but that they're putting their data that they're getting on the kids they're testing by categories on these sheets as an instructional device for the teachers. So regular class teachers would come to this clinic maybe for the summer, and they would get educated in special education and doing diagnostics and how you could connect your diagnostic results to something that we would call today RTI, and do interventions with for children that were having academic problems in your school. Another reason I like these slides from AHAP is look at the examiner, John Wallace Wallen there in the upper left. He looks just like you do several days a week. You can't see it, but he's got a stopwatch in his left hand. He's taking notes, and he's doing an individual one-to-one evaluation of a child. And at that time, they were doing them, I'm sure, by the droves. Another important method going on in Ohio is called regional services. Most school districts, until Philip Wagner comes into being in your 1940s, 50s, and 60s, 50s in particular, didn't have a school psychologist. Wagner would be very instrumental in that, and would be instrumental in your association, and would be the first psychologist in Ohio to work with the State Department of Education. And they would often have the Wagner Award or the Wagner Lecture every year. I don't know if they do that anymore in OSPA. Some things come and go. At any rate, regional services were very popular. I can remember being in a meeting in South Dakota and running into a school psychologist who before worked in Iowa, and he and one other fella covered the whole state of Iowa for the Iowa Department of Education. One covered it from Des Moines East, the other one from Des Moines West. They'd get together once in a while. They traveled with a couple of kits in their car, turned in their data to the State Department of Education, and put children in special education, and that was their entire job, and they were probably seeing hundreds of cases a year. They were doing it on a regional basis. Massachusetts also did. The regional basis here was set up and operated by this woman, Wilda May Rosebrook, who was born in 1894 and lived to be almost age 96, dying in 1990. Took her BA at Ohio Wesleyan and her Ph.D. at Ohio State University in 1931, and then was on the faculty here from 1936 to 1961 when she retired. She served as Division 16 president in 1950-51. She tied Elizabeth Woods in Wisconsin for a trivial moment here for the 1950-51 presidency. They flipped the coin and Woods won it. So it went to Wisconsin instead of to Ohio as the presidency, but Woods took a job in Japan and couldn't fulfill the presidency, so it went to Wilda May Rosebrook, and that's how she became Division 16 president, was losing a coin toss and then winning it on another count. She is very significant to the Division of School Psychology and particularly to Ohio State University, as was the regional thing. I went to dinner one time with Tom Stevens. Some of you may know Tom Stevens, who works with the School Study Council. And during dinner at a NAS conference, he slipped this under the table and he said, "I have something I think you'll be interested in." And it is a manual with Tom's name in it and Wilda Mae Rosebrook's name, and dated August 1935. But the main important thing of it really is not that she had it, but that the manual belonged to the fellow here in the lower right, Charles Scott Berry. And in World War I, when they developed the Army Alpha tests, which are a lot like the Benets, developed at the same time by the same people, it's signed to Charles Scott Berry. This was his manual. He brought it to Ohio State, gave it to Wilda Rosebrook, who I guess gave it to Tom Stevens, who gave it to me. And it's very interesting in here to see, they still have verbal absurdities in the Benet scales? You still have them? Well, there was always that one about a person comes to the post office and asks if there's a letter for him. They still have that one in there, and he says, "Well, what's your name?" He says, "Well, you won't need to know my name. You'll find it on the envelope." And the 8-year-old was supposed to say something like, "Why is that absurd?" Well, in the original manual, it's an Irishman that comes to the post office. And there was not that much interest in cultural sensitivity back then, and I think the last group over on the boat usually had most of the jokes made about them and that. The group in the middle picture is shown on the Vineland steps, and these were the people that developed the Army Alpha scales around 1916 or 1970, and it was given to thousands and thousands of people. In the middle is Henry Goddard. On the right side of the screen, seated back up one row, is Terman, who developed the Stanford Benet. And on the front row, next to Goddard, with the lighter colored suit on, is Edgar Dahl, who developed what you now use, the Vineland Social Maturity Scales. Those were developed at Vineland when he worked with Goddard, and that's kind of how it got its name. It was developed in the 1930s. I'm sure the original data is sitting in Akron, Ohio, someplace. The regional clinic was important because it would go out to a lot of different places in Ohio. 2 weeks in advance, they would collect all the data, medical data, family history data, and all that, and then they would come in, and the regional clinic would do consultations and do evaluations of children, and maybe even have the reports written up before they left. The tests administered, according to the article written by Wilda Mae Rosebrook, was the Benet Form L, which is this one here, the Good Enough Drawing Test, draw a person, gray oral reading paragraphs, the Buswell and Johns diagnostic tests, and vision and hearing were tested as well. They thought it was very important to go out and do these evaluations and get interventions for these children because, and Wilda says this, she says, people are always asking, what can we do to correct the criticism from the business people's concerns that competent people today can't spell or handle arithmetic combinations accurately and quickly? And you think, well, isn't that something not so new anymore? Certainly, Goddard is an important individual to Ohio. Goddard took his degree under Hall in 1899, worked with Francis Maxfield at Ohio State University in the 1920s. Maxfield was a graduate of Leitner Whitmer, so you have both those sources coming to Ohio. Goddard, along the way of getting to Ohio in 1922, is reported to have worked at Southern Cal University in 1888, and this is a picture of him when he was the first football coach at Southern Cal. So Goddard is shown there in the back row next to the happy-looking fella in the white shirt and white pants. That is Henry Herbert Goddard. He would go from there to Ohio State University, and he would educate individuals, including T.E. Newland, who started a big program in Illinois, Marie Skodak Chrissy, if you remember your child development, Skodak and Skills Studies in Iowa Welfare Research Station, Wilda Rosebrook, that was running the regional center later, also Stella Whiteside, that would go to the Cincinnati schools. So Goddard is a particularly important person, as would be Maxfield, that would come to the Ohio State University. In 1908, he became director of the research at the Vineland Training School for the Feeble-Minded Boys and Girls. He coins the term moron, and he's at Ohio State University from 1922 to 1938 in what was then called the Department of Abnormal and Clinical Psychology. The two were kind of connected. In fact, Division 12, Clinical Psych and APA, when it started, was called the Division of Abnormal and Clinical Psychology. Goddard would also work with Norma Cutts at Vineland, who would edit the Thayer Proceedings in 1954. And part of that proceedings shows a map of where all the school psychologists were that were members of Division 16, or at least that they could figure out at that time. You can see the cluster of people in Northeast Ohio connected to the school districts in that, as well as Central Ohio and Columbus, and probably in Southwest Ohio at Cincinnati. The next moment on the tour is the founding of your group in 1943, and it was founded by this person, Dwight Arnold, whom I had a class with in the 1960s, and at the time I had no idea he was ever connected to the School Psychologists of Ohio, which was the original name until the early 1960s. Dues were cheap, as you know from your own history, and this shows a copy of the first newsletter that I had seen in April of 1953. There's also a copy of your 50th anniversary history there, and then a more current newsletter toward the bottom there in the right. I can remember going to OSPA meetings at Atwood Lake Lodge in the 1960s. They had poker games late into the night. They had their own band. It wasn't as good as the Significant Discrepancies was the band in California, but they were pretty good. The Severe Discrepancy Band. I still have a tape of theirs somewhere. But Granville, Ohio, the Granville Inn, this is a modern picture of that, was a place that they often went to in the 1950s for meetings and board meetings and that. And then they went to Lake Atwood, and then I think later they went to Salt Fork when they got a little bit too big for Atwood Lake. But those were just great meetings, much less formal, much smaller group, but they were quite well attended. It was interesting for me to be in on the ground floor of an association like that, even though it was 25 years old at the time. It was still groping with a lot of different things, special ed legislation, internships, and that. And it's been fun to be in on the ground floor of that in Ohio, as well as Illinois, Tennessee, Louisiana, and of NASP. So OSPA is another big thing that gets done in Ohio, and another part of Ohio's significance. Another part of Ohio's significance is stop number 7, the Journal of School Psychology, which starts here in 1962-63, and the first issue comes out. Note the seal of the great state of Ohio in the lower left. The Journal of School Psychology was put together by Sam Bonham of the Ohio Department of Education with Don Ferguson at Kent State, who served as the treasurer, and this person, Don Smith. The Ohio Archives were lucky enough to give me that picture. I didn't have any pictures of him, even though I had a videotaped interview with him. He was the first editor of that journal for several years and was on the Ohio State faculty from 1959 to 1971, when he then went to Florida International University, took his Ph.D. in 1959 at Syracuse. Don always wanted to be a writer. He ended up being a journal editor. He took an undergraduate degree in English at Syracuse. The journal has published every year except volumes 1 and 2. It only had one issue in those. Other than that, it is published every year, and this shows you a very colorful history of all the issue differences for the journal over the past 50 years. So rather interesting that Ohio would be the place where the Journal of School Psychology would start. Several years later, when the journal was having financial troubles, it was offered to Division 16 to take it off their hands. The division turned it down, and 20 years later would have to pony up its own money to start its own journal, Professional School Psychology. Another stop on the tour is a meeting in Akron in 1966 when I was an intern. Jack Barden on the left was asked to come in and speak about school psychology, and Sam Bonham had just been promoted to the Division of Special Education Director instead of Chief Psychologist. Barden got up and gave the APA position, essentially saying, you can't be psychologist just because you say you are. You're no more, in fact, I remember to a group like this, he's giving the APA position, he's saying, you're no more psychologists than school counselors are counseling psychologists. You have to have a doctorate, you got to be licensed, you got to be this, this, and this in order to be that. And while you're at it, you ought to give up this special ed testing and get into consultation and other more glorious things instead of being technologists all the time. You could learn to be real professionals. End of his talk. Then Bonham got up and talked. And Bonham's basic message was, if you want to be professionals in Barden's terms, go do what Barden says. I'm no longer the chief psychologist. I can't protect you anymore. I'm now the division director of special ed. If you don't want to test the children, I'll get people who will, and you won't be here next year. That was what Bonham had to say at the 1966 meeting. I thought it was really an important time in Ohio history where they were basically saying special education and school psychology are very closely related. In fact, if you plotted the numbers of kids in special education across the 20th century and the numbers of school psychologists, those lines are pretty much parallel. So there's a very strong and very positive history in special education connection to school psych. Stop number 9, caseload analysis, 1964-65, right out of your newsletter. The average caseload was 236 in that school year. The median was 176.5. Highest loads in the big cities, lowest loads in the exempted villages. Kind of interesting, I thought that the caseload was that high, and yet there was still something on the listserv that Ohio recommends a caseload of 125 these days. Apparently, I don't know how many you're seeing, but I suspect with re-evals and that, you see a fair number of kids every year, and that there's still quite a bit of individual child study going on. Stop number 10, the Ohio Department of Education. In the 60s at least, all of these publications were coming out related to lectures, conference proceedings. You can see Philip Wagner, the father of school psychology in Ohio. He was born in 1894, died in 1958, took his undergraduate degree at Rio Grande College. I had never heard of this place. Anybody know where Rio Grande College is here in southeast Ohio? Yeah. He took it there. I found that on MapQuest or something. Took a master's degree at Ohio State University in 1930. Again, Ohio State at the forefront of a lot of things, and he's considered the father of Ohio school psychology. And I think the Mental Health Planning and Education booklet, done by Eli Bauer's lectures here for OSPA in the 60s, would be very good reading for anybody that's doing RTI with children that have mental health problems. The concept of primary, secondary, and tertiary interventions are very much in there. Another important stop in Ohio during those publications is the kinds of roles that people were serving. These are pictures out of the Ohio Department of Ed booklet saying that the school psychologist is a part of the total school program. The major function is individual child study. The school psychologist confers with school staff, and the school psychologist confers with parents. So you can see that case studies were a very, very important part. When I was an intern in Wadsworth, Ohio, and my good friends were in North Royalton as well as in Maple Heights and other areas of Ohio, Bay Village and that, I think we typically saw about 150 to 200 kids a year on internship, and that didn't include what the supervisor was seeing as well. So a fair number were certainly in there. The 11th stop is the Ohio Inter-University Council, and mainly what I want to say about this is unique. Very few states have an inter-university council of trainers connected to the State Department of Education, connected to the State School Psychology Association to help with policies, internships, and that sort of thing. So the development of that in the 1950s, and it still operates, certainly their internship program in school psychology booklet influenced what I put together with many others in the late 1970s called Standards for Field Placement Programs in School Psychology. A lot of those come right out of the Ohio and the Illinois guidelines for internships. And the Ohio model is one that I carried with me to Illinois to get their directors of university school psych programs started in the late 1960s and 70s, as well as to Tennessee to get a small, loosely organized group of trainers there. Most states have nothing like the Inter-University Council. Most states don't have any organized form of internships for that matter. Other than Ohio, New York, Illinois, and a few other places, you would not find anything but catch as catch can, no funding whatsoever provided. Many students in this country do their school psych internships for nothing. They don't get any support from the State Department of Education. They may or may not be even paid by the local district. Another aspect here is the origin point for NASP. At the Christopher Inn, I don't know where it is anymore or if it's even downtown here anymore, but in 1968, the Ohio School Psychologists Association organized a meeting and had people come. You can see the names of the 33 people there, most of them from Ohio, but certainly other states are represented, to determine whether or not they needed an alternate group to Division 16 and APA, and it was at this meeting that they set the foundation for the National Association of School Psychologists. Another reason why Ohio is significant to the history of school psychology. The organization of NASP starts here, and that was in March 21st, 22, 1968. The first convention was held in 1969 in St. Louis. Ironically, we've never been back to St. Louis for a convention. I guess there's just not a hotel there big enough to really handle it anymore. And some argued at that meeting that there really ought to be a division of CEC and be close to special ed and not set up a separate association. It obviously did not turn out that way. So a lot of people know that NASP sort of had a start here in Columbus in 1968. What they don't know is that Division 16 started here in 1944. And it was at a meeting held at Ohio State University. And the Joint Constitutional Committee in February of 1944 proposed bylaws that included a division for school psychologists, and these were then finalized at the annual APA convention in 1944, the 52nd annual convention in September 1944. So another significant aspect to Ohio is that both Division 16 and NASP start in Ohio. I have a copy of an article there that I'm showing to you if you want to trace the organizational history of school psychology. That article in the Journal of School Psychology in 1993 would be very useful to you, I think. The next is early NASP leadership. These are taken from the 1970 convention. That's the brochure there. I have the brochures for the meeting in Columbus, the meeting in St. Louis, and the meeting in Washington, D.C., the 1970 convention. I have those here if you want to see them. But there are some significant Ohioans here. If you look on the lower, or on the left side there, the woman there is Pauline Alexander. She was the first president of NASP. She organized the meeting in 1968. She was a former OSPA president and very, very active person. Unfortunately, she now has a serious case of Alzheimer's and is pretty much bedridden somewhere, I think, in South Carolina. Her son is the president of a small university in New York, and I hear from him about her occasionally. Next to her is Pete Gross, who was the division of chief psychologist, I think, for a while, maybe division director for special ed. On the other side, on the bottom, Marlene Byerly, not with the big blonde hair. The big blonde hair girl was from California, and she was the treasurer for a while of NASP. Marlene was a school psychologist here and trainer, I believe, in the state of Ohio. Seated in the middle is Bill Farling, the second executive director for NASP, and was a member of the faculty. He worked at the Ohio Department of Education, was a member of the faculty for school psych at Akron U, then at Miami of Ohio. Above him is Mike Schrin in the white shirt. Mike was the longtime school psychologist for Kent, Ohio, and was deeply committed to exceptional children, also a NASP past president. Next to him is Janko Kovacevic. Janko Kovacevic, if you can spell his name, you can spell anything. Janko Kovacevic was a school psychologist in the Akron area and was the first executive director for NASP for a few years before Bill Farling took over that. And then the other people are from New York and some other places. I'm not sure who the guy is next to Janko, but I believe he was from Ohio, and he may have been the OSPA president at that time. So a lot of early NASP leadership came out of Ohio, as well as the regional clinics, the training programs, and other things. Another is the founding of the NASP Journal, the School Psychology Digest, that then becomes the School Psychology Review in 1981. Was founded by John Guidobaldi, and Mike Schrin was treasurer of NASP at the time and encouraged John by getting the funds out of NASP to do it, and they set up the School Psychology Digest, which today, the School Psych Review, is the second largest psychology journal in the world. Only the American Psychologist has a higher circulation rate, I believe, and the history for them is largely blue, not as colorful as the Journal of School Psychology. When I pieced this together, I began to realize that it really wasn't quite as colorful, but that it has an enormous readership, and it switched from a digest format, which was gathering articles from several other sources and republishing them with commentaries and an original article that John Guidobaldi would get from somebody on that particular topic. Once it switches to the later issues and to the School Psych Review, it begins to become topical and have a whole issue or half an issue on what they would call mini-series inside each of those, as well as original articles, usually in the last edition each year. So the school psychology literature, as well as other aspects of things going on in Ohio, were very significant to the development of school psychology, not just here, but nationwide. Selected Ohio leadership. I want to finish out by showing you the pictures of some individuals. All these people came through Ohio, were born here, worked here, studied here, did something here, and became NASP presidents. Paulie Alexander, Jerry Green, still in Arizona, Cal Catterall, deceased, Mike Schrin, deceased, Ann Engen, retired in South Carolina, myself, still working full-time fortunately, John Guidabaldi, retired, living in Florida, Alex Thomas, also twice president of NASP, half retired at best, and Mike Curtis in the lower right-hand corner there. That's an impressive array. No other state is even close. Of the first 13 presidents of NASP, 7 of them came out of Ohio. 10 out of the first 20 came out of Ohio. 11 of the first 30 came out of Ohio. There have been 43 presidents, and 11 came from here. It's been 13 years, I think, since Ohio's had a NASP president, and I think it's time you had one again. You certainly have the leadership, a century of leadership, and it's time, I think, to dig around and find an Ohio one that has the kind of gumption that so many others have had. And they aren't the only people that have been important to national leadership. Liam Grimley edited the School Psychology Digest, was one of John Guidabaldi's students. Joe Zins was NASP secretary. In the top there in the middle, you see Tom Stevens, who's still working for the Ohio School Study Council. He served on my dissertation in the 1960s, is now semi-retired. Paul Warden, on the top right, went to Oklahoma State. Kathy Telsrow was very important, several NASP positions. She's retired. Keith Perkins left Ohio, where he had been for a long time the director of child study on the Board of Education in Akron. And he went from there to Arizona, started a very famous school consultation service that still operates in Arizona, and served a lot of the schools from an agency that he had created. Keith Perkins, a very interesting fellow, long since retired and deceased. Bill and Kathleen Farling, shown here in this photo of 2010, are living in North Carolina. Bill was NASP Executive Director and also worked at Akron U in Miami and Ohio Department of Education. Another bunch of Ohioans. Bob Germain was our treasurer of NASP in 84-86. Janet Liston, recently deceased, was NASP Delegate and Director. Ed Fiskus was on many NASP committee assignments. Tom Hohenschel started vocational school psychology at Virginia Tech University. Judy Genschaft, now president of the University of South Florida, was NASP secretary in 83-85. And Julia Wright, who's now retired, was a NASP treasurer and a past president of your organization as well. There are many, many other people I could mention that belong up here. I just don't have very good pictures of them yet. Mike Kabler, Antoinette Miranda, Audrey Bashan, Janet Graydon, Nadine Block, Kathy McNamara, and of course you can see Kevin McLaughlin is on here as well, does his work at Kent State University, as well as international school psychology kinds of efforts. So Ohio has had a rather substantial history, all of it, I think, very positive in terms of the shoulders that have been produced on whom we stand today as we practice. For at least a century and for 70 years of OSPA, I think Ohio has been a rising sun among the north central states. People look to Ohio. A lot of things have radiated out of here. I know you get the meetings like this, you get a few drinks in you at the bar, and you start complaining. Why don't they do this in my district? Why don't schools? Most states have nothing like you have in Ohio. If you crossed the Ohio River heading south and traded places with most practitioners down there, you would both faint at what you saw. It's just amazing, some of the kinds of things that are still going on. When I went to Tennessee in 1976, they had a State Department directive saying that children should no longer be placed in mental retardation rooms simply on the basis of their score on the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test. The Peabody was developed at Peabody College. All the norms were Nashville, but they were using it. And Ohio has really been blessed. You have so many things going for you here that other states don't. You have done a great job of training and mentoring your students and young practitioners. Your internships program is certainly one that is modeled in many, many places across the states. You've blazed many, many trails that other states have tried to follow, many of them successfully, but they can look to Ohio, to the Department of Ed, and especially to OSPA and to school psychology practice for a lot of guidance there. This is what Ohio would look like without school psychology, quite frankly. Long ago, Bertha Luckey said some things about school psychology and what it might be in the future, but you've mixed tradition. RTI is mixing new things with old ways. still doing special education, finding better ways to do this. I found this photo, I took this photo in Illinois a few years ago. Always liked the mix of tradition as well as the modern sitting in that parking lot. When Bertha Lucky was asked in her presidential speech in 1951 what she thought the future would withhold, this is what she said in her presidential address. "I do not know all the duties that the future will hold for school psychologists, but I will agree that it is challenging array, never the same, with constantly new avenues of research opening up. There are large rewards in friendships and social contacts. The school psychologist is on the line of skirmish. There may be a lot of dust and noise, humor and pathos, but I guarantee it will never be a quiet or a dull life." She was just about finishing out her days there. I guess she had one more decade with the Cleveland Public Schools at that time, but Bertha Lucky was certainly very significant. And I think you ought to know now, if you didn't before we started, that a lot of that dust and noise has come out of the great state of Ohio as well. You are, in my opinion, the silver lining behind the clouds in the lives of children. Children's lives with troubles are the things that you work with. It's the things that school psychologists have tried to do for the past 100 years or so. Today's program reflects, I think, some of the breadth that you have in the convention today of looking at bullying, cyberbullying, suicide issues and that, but we still have special ed as our core. Over the past 40 or 50 years, I know there have been calls for school psychologists to do something else or to be an expert in everything under the sun. You do very, very well at what you do. Don't let anybody make you feel guilty about what you do. And I know that we do sometimes try to do that. We make you feel like you shouldn't be doing special education so much. You should be a consultant. You should be doing this, doing research and program evaluation, and get out of that individual child study mold. I can assure you that school psychology was founded on the individual child study mode, and there's nobody better in the schools of Ohio than you in terms of doing measurement and evaluation work with children. You are indeed the silver lining behind the clouds in the lives of children, and you have nothing to hang your head about. You should hold it high. You should be proud of everything you do. I know it's not always easy. I know there are some rough days in that, but you are indeed a part of that, and you are an important part of that. So don't ever hold your head down thinking that I'm not doing something important. There aren't any parent groups out there asking for school psychologists to be removed from the schools. They're out there headhunting for some people, but not school psychologists. We don't have lawsuits to fight all the time or anything else because we're doing on a day-to-day basis what the schools need to have done for children, and we have done it in Ohio for 100 years, and OSPA has done it next year for 70 years, so nothing but pride here. You indeed are the future of the history of school psychology. You'll be part of the history of school psychology. My wife and I have been connected to school psychology in various places for the past 43 years, and all we can say is thanks for 43 really great years.